Earlier in the Living Well program, we talked a little bit about the role that fats play in the disease process and the impact of an unhealthy diet. And as we look at fats, what component of fat may have a beneficial effect and what aspect of fats may be more detrimental. So in week 2, we talked a bit about the role that unsaturated fats, the healthy fats, played. This week I'd like to talk a little bit more about fats as a whole and understanding the role that both of these fats play. If we take a look at fat, fat consists of both saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Now I'm sure these are terms that many of you have heard about because these types of fats are talked a lot about in other health conditions like heart disease, weight management, diabetes. And what we know about these two I think is really important to share because it can help you make more healthful decisions in your diet. Now if we look at saturated fats, these are fats that are typically solid at room temperature. They have that characteristic to them. We recognize them as the marbling on the meats, the skin on the chicken, or we find them in whole fat dairy products like whipping cream, half and half, whole milk, butter. These are all sources of saturated fats, and they're typically associated with animal products, but not exclusively. They're also found in some vegetable products like palm, coconut, palm kernel oils, and hydrogenated fats. And these types of fats in these other sources are used very frequently in things like baked goods, pie crusts. It's what makes croissants so light and fluffy and flaky. These saturated fats in our diet provide that great mouthfeel in foods. And so saturated fats, as wonderful as they taste, they're quite associated with many negative health effects. For instance, they're closely linked to heart disease and atherosclerosis. And so these types of fats we really want to try to limit in the diet. And we can do that by choosing leaner cuts of meat using lower fat dairy products. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As we talk about saturated fats, I also need to talk a bit about trans fats. This is something that is very front of mind for people. We hear about the detriments of trans fats. Restaurants, cities across the country are banning trans fats in restaurants. And to understand what trans fats are is to look at their chemical structure. And while this doesn't represent completely the chemical structure of these fat molecules, it talks a little bit about the difference between the orientation of important molecules. In nature, and naturally occurring in fatty acids, there is a configuration that has these hydrogen molecules side by side. But when we take a liquid oil and we make it more solid, as we might do from a corn oil liquid form to a corn oil margarine to perhaps a product like a shortening, a solid shortening, this process changes the orientation. And we call this process hydrogenation. And that's a term that you may also be very familiar with. It's the process of taking this liquid oil and making it more solid. And remember when I mentioned before that saturated fats are solid at room temperature. The more solid you make a fat, the more saturated it can tend to be. And so these trans fats are created, they're man-made, and so we do this in this process. And what we know about these trans fats is they have just as detrimental health effects as saturated fats. No more, no less. Both are equally as detrimental to the body from a health standpoint.